Have you ever wondered why it feels like no matter what governments do, the world keeps spiraling deeper into economic uncertainty? What if I told you that this isn't random chaos, but a meticulously designed cycle that few have the power to control and everyone else is caught in? The truth is shocking. For centuries, the global economy has been shaped by a handful of architects who created rules nobody can escape. Rules that dictate when markets crash, when debts explode, and when entire nations bend to invisible forces they cannot see. This isn't theory. It's history repeating itself in patterns so precise it almost feels like a blueprint for control. From the moment governments began borrowing, lending, and creating money beyond tangible wealth, a hidden rhythm emerged. Interest, debt, and currency became tools, not just for growth, but for dominance. Every crisis you've witnessed, every economic collapse that made headlines, was part of this cycle. Designed incentives, engineered dependencies, and invisible strings pulling entire economies in a direction the average citizen cannot influence. And here's the unsettling part. Most people don't realize how deep this influence goes. It shapes jobs, markets, healthcare, housing, and even the opportunities available to each generation. Imagine a game where the rules are invisible and the winners wrote the rule book centuries ago. They designed a system that can never truly be repaid, where money flows upward, interest accumulates endlessly, and governments are trapped in cycles of borrowing, restructuring, and dependency. Nations think they are free, yet their choices are constrained by invisible forces built over generations. And the worst part? The cycle accelerates silently. While people debate politics and policies, the underlying mechanisms that dictate wealth, stability, and collapse are quietly operating, often benefiting those already at the top. You may be thinking, this sounds unbelievable. How can one system control so much? But when you follow the threads of history, the evidence is overwhelming. From Europe's financial experiments centuries ago to the creation of modern central banks, the patterns are unmistakable. Each stage of the cycle was engineered with precision, ensuring that crises serve a purpose for the architects, consolidating power, extracting wealth, and shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways that benefit them. And it's not just history. Right now, you are witnessing the consequences of the same mechanisms at work, from global debt levels to inflation, trade dependencies, and financial market manipulations. Now, I want you to think about this. What you're about to discover in this video could challenge everything you've assumed about money, governments, and control. It's essential to understand these patterns, not just for knowledge, but to recognize how your life is affected by decisions made far above your reach. So, before we continue, take a moment. Reflect. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of economic uncertainty? That feeling isn't accidental. It's part of the design. And while it may seem overwhelming, awareness is the first step. If this resonates, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences with economic cycles. Hit the like button if you want to stay informed about these hidden forces. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next stages of this story. The insights ahead will reveal not just what is happening, but why it was set up this way and what it means for everyone living under this cycle. What you're about to uncover may surprise you, and it sets the stage for understanding the architects, the traps, and the mechanisms that govern the entire global economy. The foundation of the modern economic cycle begins with 4 architects whose innovations shaped the entire global financial system, each building upon the work of the previous generation to ensure debt would never truly disappear. The first, William Paterson, established the Bank of England in 1694, creating a system where governments could borrow endlessly and pay interest forever without ever repaying the principal. This was revolutionary. Debt became permanent, not a problem to solve, but a tool of power. Governments that once struggled to fund wars or infrastructure were suddenly able to borrow without limit, while a small group of financiers reaped consistent, guaranteed profits. This principle alone set the stage for centuries of economic dependence, as it created a cycle where money flowed upward to those who controlled credit. A century later, Nathan Rothschild expanded the model, turning national debt into a global, tradable instrument. No longer confined to local lenders or merchants, government bonds could now circulate across borders, creating a web of interdependence. The Rothschilds mastered timing, intelligence, and market influence, exploiting crises to accumulate wealth and consolidate control. By making sovereign debt transferable and interconnected, default became nearly impossible without triggering systemic collapse. Nations were no longer isolated. One misstep could ripple across continents. What was once an instrument of funding became a mechanism of strategic leverage. By the early 20th century, J.P. Morgan and his associates institutionalized the system in the United States, designing what would become the Federal Reserve. Now, governments could borrow infinitely, with central banks purchasing bonds created from thin air, ensuring perpetual liquidity. Interest would continue to flow upward, while the majority of citizens remained unaware that their taxes and savings were being channeled directly into the coffers of private financial institutions. The cycle became self-reinforcing. More debt led to more money creation, more financial influence, and greater dependence of nations on the architect's mechanisms. Finally, in the late 20th century, Paul Volcker perfected the trap. By manipulating interest rates and controlling inflation, he ensured that developing nations and advanced economies alike would remain bound to the debt system. Defaults were no longer tolerated. Restructuring and conditional lending became standard, reinforcing dependence on the central institutions. Nations that could not meet their obligations were forced to surrender control over policies, markets, and assets, all while the global debt machine continued to expand. Together, these four architects created a world in which debt is structural, perpetual, and inescapable. Patterson designed permanence. Rothschild globalized it, Morgan institutionalized it, and Volcker entrenched it. Every government, every central bank, every financial crisis now operates within this carefully constructed system. The cycle is invisible to most, yet its influence shapes economies, politics, and societies. Citizens experience the consequences: rising costs, inflation, and uncertainty, without ever seeing the invisible hand that controls the sequence. Once the architects had established the mechanisms, the world became a stage for the cycle to repeat itself, often invisibly but with devastating effects. Debt was no longer just a number on a ledger. It became the backbone of power, shaping nations and controlling their destinies. Every decision made by governments, from interest rate adjustments to trade policies, now had to navigate the invisible architecture of perpetual debt, ensuring that economic freedom was largely an illusion. Countries could grow, but only within the limits defined by the system. Any deviation risked triggering a chain reaction, forcing them back into alignment with the cycle. This cycle operates like clockwork, and history provides ample proof. When a nation accumulates debt beyond its productive capacity, it is forced to borrow even more just to maintain basic operations. Public programs, infrastructure, and social investments are subordinated to the relentless servicing of interest. Financial crises, market collapses, and recessions are not anomalies. They are the result of systemic design. The pattern becomes clear. As debt grows, the power of a select few magnifies, while the broader population becomes increasingly vulnerable to shocks and manipulations. The system is reinforced through interconnected institutions. International banks, central banks, sovereign funds, and asset managers all operate within the same web, ensuring that default is almost impossible without creating global repercussions. A single misstep in one nation's economy can cascade, affecting supply chains, currencies, and financial markets across continents. This isn't speculation, it's the blueprint the architects left behind. Volcker, Morgan, Rothschild, and Patterson engineered mechanisms that respond to crises in ways that maintain their influence, making sure the debt trap persists regardless of political shifts or popular movements. Modern examples demonstrate the cycle in action. Nations like Greece, Argentina, and emerging markets consistently experience crises that appear unique but follow the same structural rules. Interest payments balloon, governments restructure debt, austerity measures are imposed, and central institutions remain in control. Even the most developed economies are caught. The United States, Japan, and the European Union have all expanded their debt far beyond sustainable limits, relying on the same mechanisms to avoid default while simultaneously increasing dependence on the global financial system. The cycle repeats, invisible yet unavoidable, shaping political decisions, social stability, and economic growth. What makes this system so insidious is its subtlety. Ordinary citizens rarely perceive the strings that guide policy, trade, and currency valuation. Yet every tax, every interest rate adjustment, and every bailout operates according to the rules laid down centuries ago. The architect's legacy persists because the mechanisms are self-reinforcing, invisible to most, and designed to survive every political upheaval, technological change, and economic experiment. Awareness of the system reveals a world where choices are constrained, outcomes are predictable, and the cycles of boom and bust are engineered, not incidental. History shows us that no nation, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is immune to the economic cycle meticulously designed by these architects. The same patterns that controlled Europe's empires centuries ago are still visible today in modern crises. Nations like Spain, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union all followed a predictable sequence: overextension, debt accumulation, currency challenges, social unrest, and finally collapse. They were convinced of their exceptionalism, thinking that their wealth, military strength, or ideology would protect them. Yet the architect's blueprint proved to be unstoppable, and the lessons were never learned in time. Modern economies are no different. The United States, for instance, is trapped in the same stage-based system. Military overextension, reliance on foreign imports, staggering national debt, and social inequality all mirror historical precedents. Europe, Japan, and emerging markets face similar constraints, constrained by debt structures, trade dependencies, and the invisible rules that dictate economic survival. Financial crises, inflationary waves, and market collapses are not anomalies. They are the inevitable outcomes of a system that is perfectly engineered to maintain control and channel resources upward to those who designed it. The implications are profound. Citizens experience rising costs, wage stagnation, and volatile markets, while institutions designed to manage the economy maintain control over the outcomes. Governments appear to act independently, yet their options are largely predetermined by the mechanisms of the cycle. Even policy decisions that seem progressive, such as stimulus packages or interest rate changes, operate within the same structural framework, ensuring the cycle continues. Awareness of this hidden architecture exposes a reality few are prepared to face. Economic stability is largely an illusion, and crises are inevitable checkpoints that reinforce the architect's influence. Understanding this pattern changes everything. It explains why financial collapses occur even in prosperous nations, why debt never truly disappears, and why central banks, asset managers, and global institutions maintain power across centuries. The cycle is not simply a backdrop to history. It is an active force shaping lives, careers, governments, and the very trajectory of nations. Recognizing these mechanisms is critical because it allows people to perceive not just the consequences, but the intentional design behind economic volatility. The modern global economy is an intricate web where every nation, regardless of wealth or influence, is caught within the architect's trap. Debt, once a tool to fund wars or development, has become a structural dependency that nations cannot escape. Even powerful economies like the United States or Japan operate under constraints imposed centuries ago, forced to borrow, refinance, and service obligations that continuously expand. Emerging markets, meanwhile, face the harshest realities. Every fluctuation in global interest rates, currency valuations, or commodity prices can trigger crises, exposing their vulnerabilities and reinforcing dependence on global financial institutions. Trade imbalances and supply chain dependencies intensify the cycle. Nations import goods they could produce domestically, exporting raw materials or currencies to sustain deficits, while advanced economies rely on global labor networks to maintain consumption. This interconnected system creates a feedback loop. One country's debt accumulation or economic misstep sends ripples across continents, influencing currencies, stock markets, and the cost of living worldwide. Governments appear to act autonomously, yet their choices are constrained by obligations embedded in the global debt network. Structural dependence ensures that defaults, even if attempted, are quickly mitigated through interventions designed to maintain systemic stability. The consequence is a paradox. While nations appear sovereign, their economies are subtly orchestrated. Central banks, international institutions, and private asset managers act as conductors of a symphony few notice, steering liquidity, debt instruments, and monetary policies to maintain the cycle. Even when countries attempt independent reforms, the cycle adjusts, absorbing deviations and realigning them with the established system. Crises, therefore, are not failures, but scheduled checkpoints that consolidate control and reinforce the hierarchical distribution of wealth and influence. Social and political pressures compound the effect. Rising inequality, unemployment, and inflation create domestic unrest, pressuring governments to prioritize debt servicing over social programs. Citizens experience the consequences of the cycle in their daily lives: higher costs, reduced opportunities, and increasing economic uncertainty. Yet most remain unaware of the structural forces dictating outcomes. The system ensures that wealth, influence, and decision-making power remain concentrated at the top, with the majority navigating constraints designed long before their time. Recognizing these dynamics reveals the depth of the trap. The modern economy is not a free market. It is a carefully maintained network that benefits a select few while keeping nations and populations in perpetual dependency. Each crisis, each adjustment, each restructuring serves the purpose of preserving the cycle, ensuring the architect's influence extends across centuries. Citizens may debate policy, elections, or leadership, but the underlying architecture dictates which outcomes are feasible, reinforcing the inevitability of repetition. One of the most powerful mechanisms in this economic cycle is the creation of money itself, a process that seems abstract but shapes every aspect of global finance. Central banks, designed centuries ago by the architects we've already discussed, have the authority to issue currency, purchase government bonds, and control liquidity on a scale that ensures perpetual influence. Money is no longer simply a medium of exchange. It has become an instrument of control, dictating who prospers, who remains dependent, and which nations can withstand shocks. By creating currency from debt, these institutions have embedded the cycle so deeply that escaping it is nearly impossible. When a government issues bonds to finance spending, central banks often purchase them using newly created money. This expands the money supply, allowing governments to meet obligations without defaulting, but it also entrenches the structural debt cycle. Interest payments continue to flow upward to institutions controlling these bonds, ensuring a continuous transfer of resources from taxpayers to financial power holders. The system appears self-sustaining, liquidity supports markets, crises are mitigated, and confidence is maintained. But the underlying dependency grows with each intervention. Nations cannot escape without risking collapse, and even attempts at fiscal independence are absorbed by the same mechanisms, maintaining the architect's control. The creation of money from debt has cascading effects on global trade, investment, and economic stability. Currency valuations, commodity prices, and interest rates are manipulated indirectly through monetary policy, influencing the cost of imports, exports, and domestic goods. Economies that resist borrowing or reform may face capital flight, increased borrowing costs, or trade disadvantages, reinforcing compliance with the cycle. Wealth concentration intensifies as those with access to capital and insight into monetary operations benefit disproportionately, while ordinary citizens absorb the consequences of inflation, debt service, and economic volatility. Historical crises, from the defaults of early European nations to modern sovereign debt restructuring, illustrate the effectiveness of this mechanism. Governments that appeared independent were compelled to align with the system, often accepting austerity, conditional lending, or policy, mandates designed to maintain stability and continuous debt servicing. The architect's design ensures that interventions, bailouts, and monetary expansions serve their objectives, perpetuating the cycle, consolidating influence, and preventing true economic freedom from emerging. In the contemporary world, this mechanism extends globally. Advanced economies, emerging markets, and developing nations alike operate within the parameters of money created from debt. Central banks, large assets, managers, and financial institutions orchestrate the flow of capital, controlling the trajectory of entire economies. Citizens experience rising costs, market volatility, and the illusion of economic crises being unpredictable, when in reality they are guided by invisible forces structured over centuries. The creation of money from debt is not a flaw. It is the core engine of the economic cycle, ensuring continuity, dependence, and the preservation of power. Behind every economic decision, every policy adjustment, and every market intervention are the institutions and individuals who profit most from the cycle. Large banks, asset managers, and financial dynasties operate in a system designed to perpetuate their wealth and control. While governments appear to govern independently, the reality is that financial institutions orchestrate outcomes, subtly influencing interest rates, bond purchases, and liquidity injections to ensure the cycle continues uninterrupted. These actors are the ultimate beneficiaries of crises, bailouts, and debt expansions. They thrive when the system falters because the mechanisms in place guarantee that recovery, restructuring, and monetary policy reinforce their advantage. Consider how debt restructurings are handled globally. When nations default or struggle to meet obligations, international institutions step in with structured loans, conditional programs, and austerity mandates. While presented as assistance, these interventions maintain dependence, directing funds in ways that serve creditors rather than citizens. Financial institutions extract interest, impose policy conditions, and maintain leverage over governments, ensuring that even in times of apparent chaos, power remains concentrated at the top. The global economy appears unpredictable, yet it operates like clockwork within a system meticulously designed to maintain hierarchy, influence, and resource control. The modern elite understands the cyclical nature of crises. Each downturn is an opportunity to consolidate assets, acquire undervalued properties, and increase influence over markets and nations. While ordinary citizens face inflation, job insecurity, and reduced purchasing power, those with access to capital and inside knowledge gain disproportionate advantages. It is a system that converts instability into opportunity for the few, while the majority absorb the consequences. The mechanisms themselves are invisible, but the outcomes are tangible. Wealth, concentration, policy compliance, and the continual reinforcement of dependency across nations and populations. This cycle operates globally, transcending borders and political systems. No government is immune. Even the most advanced economies rely on central banks and financial institutions to manage crises, implement monetary policy, and maintain the illusion of independence. From Tokyo to Washington, London to Brasilia, the same structures ensure that debt flows upward and dependence persists. Ordinary citizens rarely perceive this orchestration, yet their lives, through taxes, inflation, and limited economic opportunities, reflect the system's influence every day. Awareness of this dynamic is essential because it reveals the patterns behind both apparent prosperity and inevitable crises. As the cycle progresses, the tipping points become more pronounced, and nations experience the consequences of cumulative debt and systemic dependency. Economic stress manifests through interest rate fluctuations, inflationary pressures, and currency volatility, each exacerbating vulnerabilities across the interconnected global system. When governments struggle to balance budgets, fund social programs, or maintain infrastructure, the pressure intensifies. What appears as an isolated financial crisis is often a symptom of the broader, orchestrated cycle, revealing the invisible architecture underlying every market, trade agreement, and fiscal policy. The interdependence of modern economies amplifies these effects. A financial shock in one country spreads rapidly through trade networks, capital flows, and currency markets. Emerging economies are particularly exposed. They depend on foreign capital, export revenues, and global financial stability to maintain economic function. When interest rates rise or commodity prices fluctuate, debts become unsustainable and governments are forced into interventions aligned with global institutions' expectations, even advanced. Economies are not immune. While the United States, Europe, and Japan can borrow extensively and access liquidity, they too face constraints that maintain systemic compliance and perpetuate dependence on central banks and financial institutions. This system's predictability is both elegant and ruthless. Every crisis follows a pattern: debt accumulation, monetary intervention, austerity or restructuring, followed by temporary stabilization, only to repeat at higher levels. Market participants anticipate these cycles, adjusting portfolios, currencies, and investments to capitalize on predictable fluctuations. Wealth consolidates at the top, while the majority of citizens experience the disruptive consequences of rising costs, unemployment, and diminished purchasing power. It is a self-reinforcing loop. The mechanisms that stabilize economies simultaneously ensure dependency, resource extraction, and concentration of influence among those controlling capital. The psychological dimension of the cycle is equally significant. Public perception, media narratives, and policy framing are carefully aligned to maintain confidence and legitimacy in the system. Citizens perceive crises as unexpected shocks, yet each downturn is engineered and amplified to ensure that solutions reinforce the existing structures of power. Even seemingly independent interventions, such as quantitative easing, fiscal stimulus, or regulatory reforms, operate within the constraints of the cycle, preserving the architect's intended outcomes. Awareness of these dynamics reveals the strategic orchestration behind economic volatility and demonstrates that what appears chaotic is, in fact, meticulously managed to maintain control over global resources. By examining these mechanisms in action, it becomes clear that economic crises are not anomalies, mistakes, or unavoidable consequences. They are the predictable output of a carefully designed system. Nations and populations are compelled to participate, adapt, and comply, ensuring that the cycle continues unabated. The more we understand these patterns, the better equipped we are to anticipate, interpret, and navigate the challenges inherent in a system engineered to maintain dependency, consolidate wealth, and perpetuate power across generations. As the cycle advances, certain warning signs become increasingly apparent, signaling that nations are approaching critical thresholds. Indicators such as rising debt to GDP ratios, persistent trade deficits, over-reliance on external financing, and chronic fiscal imbalances all suggest that the system is stretched to its limits. These signals, visible in both advanced and emerging economies, illustrate the structural constraints imposed by the architect's design. When a country exceeds these thresholds, it is no longer operating within a safe zone. It is entering a stage where small perturbations, policy missteps, market shocks, or geopolitical tensions can trigger cascading crises that ripple across borders. In emerging markets, these vulnerabilities are stark. Economies dependent on foreign investment, volatile commodities, or external debt face heightened exposure to currency devaluations and interest rate spikes. When obligations exceed revenue streams, governments are forced into structural adjustments mandated by international institutions. These adjustments, often framed as solutions, reinforce the cycle by prioritizing debt servicing and market stability over domestic growth or social welfare. Advanced economies are similarly constrained. Even nations with significant resources cannot escape the structural dependencies created by debt and monetary policy, meaning that systemic shocks, such as banking crises or sudden market corrections, propagate globally. Financial markets, aware of these constraints, operate in anticipation of the cycle's stages. Investors, traders, and institutions monitor debt levels, interest rate trends, and fiscal signals to position capital strategically. Crises that appear unexpected are often predictable to those with insight into the system, allowing wealth and power to consolidate further at the top. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens experience the effects: rising costs, reduced economic opportunity, and uncertainty, without access to the mechanisms shaping outcomes. This invisibility ensures compliance with the cycle, as nations and populations internalize the constraints without fully recognizing their origin. The structural rigidity of the system makes deviation perilous. Attempts at radical reform, debt cancellation, or alternative monetary policies face immediate constraints: capital flight, investor pressure, or currency depreciation. Even temporary solutions, such as stimulus programs, quantitative easing, or emergency lending, operate within the parameters of the cycle, maintaining systemic control and perpetuating dependency. Every intervention reinforces the architect's original design, ensuring that the sequence of debt accumulation, crisis, intervention, and stabilization continues. Understanding these signals is critical because they provide insight into the timing and severity of potential crises. By analyzing debt structures, fiscal imbalances, and market vulnerabilities, it becomes clear that the cycle is not only persistent, but escalating. Governments, institutions, and citizens are participants in a system engineered for continuity and compliance, where visible prosperity masks underlying fragility, and each crisis serves to reinforce the architect's control over the global economy. Awareness of these dynamics offers clarity on why the cycle persists and why the consequences of deviation are so significant. The culmination of this meticulously designed economic cycle is not a distant possibility. It is a reality that governments, institutions, and citizens navigate every day without fully realizing its scope. At this stage, debt levels, monetary policies, and systemic dependencies converge to create a precarious balance. Even minor disruptions, market corrections, political instability, or supply chain shocks can trigger profound consequences because the mechanisms of control are so tightly interwoven. The architects built redundancy into the system, ensuring that no single nation or policy change can escape its influence. The cycle's persistence demonstrates the scale of its design. It is global, self-reinforcing, and virtually inescapable. Every intervention, bailout, and policy adjustment operates within these structural limits. Central banks inject liquidity, governments refinance debt, and markets stabilize temporarily, but each action reinforces the framework that maintains the architect's power. Citizens experience the outcomes through rising costs, job instability, and fluctuating purchasing power, yet most fail to recognize the invisible forces dictating these realities. Awareness of the cycle illuminates how history, policy, and finance intersect to preserve the system, and why deviations are met with rapid corrections that perpetuate dependency. Understanding this is critical not only to comprehend current economic conditions, but to anticipate future challenges and recognize patterns before they escalate. The architect's system extends beyond mere financial mechanics. It shapes societal outcomes, policy choices, and geopolitical dynamics. Nations that appear independent are constrained by debt, obligations, monetary mechanisms, and global interconnections. Crises are orchestrated or amplified in ways that consolidate wealth and influence, ensuring that those at the top retain power, while governments remain trapped in cycles of borrowing, servicing, and intervention. The pattern is deliberate, invisible to most, yet the consequences manifest in every aspect of daily life. Recognizing these forces allows a clearer perspective on why certain economic outcomes repeat across centuries and why crises often feel inevitable. If you followed this journey to the end, you now have a deeper understanding of the hidden mechanisms shaping our world. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to continue uncovering these patterns and gain insights into how global economies operate behind the scenes. Leave a comment with the phrase, "This message was for me," to show you've understood the cycle and its implications. Hit the like button if this information has shifted your perspective, and explore the next video right here. It complements this discussion, diving further into the forces guiding financial and geopolitical outcomes in ways few ever see. By engaging, sharing your thoughts, and following the content, you become part of the conversation that reveals the hidden structure behind global economic reality.